Thank you all for joining us today for the National Conference of State Legislatures webinar, Energy Development and the Department of Defense State Policy Options, which is brought to you jointly by the NCSL Energy Program and the Military and Veterans Affairs Program. My name is Glenn Anderson. I'm the Director of the Energy Program at NCSL, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. The webinar today will be focusing on challenges that utility-scale renewable energy and associated electric power transmission projects can present to Department of Defense activities, and how to ensure that development impacts are minimized. We will hear today how states have included the DoD in their project planning and review phases, and the goal really is to see how states have addressed these particular concerns. We also have a legisbrief coming out in September that will further explore the topic. Before I begin, I just want to let you know a few items regarding today's webinar. Presentations will be posted after the webinar along with the recording. After the presentations, we will have a question and answer period. Feel free to ask questions by entering them in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen at any time. We will be sending out a link to the webinar, the recorded webinar, and the presentations shortly within a few days after we get it posted online. And we will now proceed with our first speaker. We are fortunate to have Bill Van Houten from DoD's Siting Clearinghouse as our first speaker today. He is the Deputy Director of the Siting Clearinghouse and has been on the program since its inception in 2009, just before Congress passed legislation to create the clearinghouse in 2011. He has worked in multiple positions at DoD over the last 30 years. He began his career with the Navy, where he eventually became a contracting officer for aircraft and research and development programs, as well as having a position on the Navy Inspector General staff. He then moved to the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where he has managed international environmental programs, worker safety, greenhouse gas accounting and policy, and most recently, encroachment as it relates to the clearinghouse functions. So let's welcome Bill Van Houten.
All right, thank you. So I'm happy to be with you today, and I just wanted to let you know as well that I'm going to be joined in this by Mr. Mike Imony, who is the director of the clearinghouse. And Mike's resume would put mine to shame. So I think it'll be important to hear from him over the course of this webinar. I have a lot of slides, but my object is to race through them because I really would like to have as much time as possible for a discussion. So could we go to the second slide, please? All right, so just to let you know where we're going, I want to give you a little bit of a background on why we're here as well as what the clearinghouse is. So what you need to understand is that renewable energy sources, especially wind turbines and solar towers to a lesser extent, can impede DoD operations, training, and testing. The issue we've got with the sources generally, for instance, they impact radar through EMI. There's a glint glare issue associated with solar, and we've also got obstruction issues as well because of the height of many of these renewable energy sources and even the transmission towers, which are my second point. The transmission towers can also impact military mission, both through EMI and obstruction. So the Congress in 2011, and actually DoD decided even on its own to start looking at this in 2009, we've established a clearinghouse at DoD in order to look at the risk through a mission compatibility evaluation process. But I've got to say that even though we have this process, federal protections are still somewhat limited because in essence our process is tied to an FAA process, and this is on slide 3, please. An FAA process which evaluates obstructions. And while we can make it more difficult to go forward with a project. In fact, even if the FAA makes a determination that a project is a hazard to navigation, it does not outright prevent the project from being built. And in fact, a prime example of that would be the Stratosphere Tower in Las Vegas, which was objected to, but there it is today, and actually does cause some issues with the nearby airports. So it is not a total solution, and hence we're here today. I've got to say the standard under which we operate is to look at things to determine whether or not they're an unacceptable risk to national security. That is a high bar for us to meet. Congress wants us to have a high bar because the object is to try to permit as much renewable energy and transmission as we can reasonably permit, but in the end, some projects we may have to object to because we find no way to mitigate them. But I will say the first step in the process is to see what we can clear. There's a very small subset of projects where we can't clear them right away. We enter into discussions in order to mitigate issues, and then if and only if we can't find a mitigation solution, we would object to it. And to date, we have actually gone forward with no formal objections because we've been pretty successful finding ways around. And what that brings up in part is it's also important for people to talk to us early in the process, because the more time we have in order to come up with a mitigation solution, the better off all parties will be. But my bottom line here gets to why we're here today, and is that we could still use further protections at state and local level. We're not advocating for it, but we are merely going to let you know what some other states and local governments have done. Next slide, please. And then, which gets to my section on just the history and purpose of the clearinghouse. Next slide, please. I want you to be aware that the Siting Clearinghouse has a website. The website address should be on the bottom of the slide, but it almost looks like it's cut off. We'll see if it's on the next one any clearer. Next slide, please. All right. That's, let me just tell you, so you can Google DoD Siting Clearinghouse, or I will, when these materials are posted, the website will certainly be on there. So what you need to understand is that the clearinghouse operates in order to try to develop a single voice for the DoD. There are many parts of DoD. People don't know which part of DoD to contact. There are the military services. There are the functional leads within the Office of the Secretary of Defense. There's the Joint Staff. There have been issues where people have gone to a local installation, and that installation gives them a partial answer as to whether or not something could potentially be objected to, but it's not the full answer. So the clearinghouse is here to try to get all of the stakeholders together within DoD and come up with a broader view of what issues we might have. Next slide, please. Well, if we had the next slide, please. There. Okay. We'll get off this pretty quickly. I just want you to be aware that under the National Defense Authorization Act of 2011, Section 358 contains a statute which sets up the clearinghouse. It basically talks about we have to come up with a comprehensive strategy. It talks about our authority to object. There's also a provision whereby we can do voluntary contributions, and there actually is the clearinghouse web address on this. Next slide. And of course, because we have a statute, we then promulgated a rule under which we operate. That rule is located at 32 CFR Part 211. It outlines the mission compatibility evaluation process. It talks about how parties external to the DoD can contact the DoD and work their issues with the DoD. Next slide, please. And it was published in December 2011. I had alluded to this earlier, but what you need to understand is that we've actually been very successful in clearing projects. The vast majority are cleared very quickly, something on the order of 96%. Those that aren't go into a mitigation process, and we've been extremely successful. So it's only for the absolute worst case scenarios where we would look to try to make it more difficult to build a project. Next slide, please, which introduces the next section, which deals with what's on the horizon for wind turbine transmission line development. So next slide, please. I'll admit that the next several slides, the next two slides I've gotten from the Department of Energy from other sources. Department of Energy is showing that right now we're looking at something like a 5 times increase in wind turbine installed capacity between where we are now and where it will be by 2030. One thing that will start to happen during that time is that they're predicting that there'll be some offshore as well, but the vast majority will continue to be on land. Next slide, please. And the other thing that's happening is that wind turbines are getting larger and larger, and in fact, as they go offshore, they will get larger still. You're probably looking at things like 700, even 800 feet, because it's so expensive to anchor them. They're going to have to be even taller. So, and obviously, as they get taller, the obstruction hazard increases. Next slide, please. So the points I want to make from this are the point I made. We're looking at a potential great increase in the amount of wind energy across the country. Turbine sizes are increasing, which is going to make it further difficult for DOD to operate. And the new concept here is that in addition, we're going to have a cumulative impact problem, because there are areas of the country right now where DOD does not have an issue, but as you put more and more turbines up, the impact on us increases. So it's something we've got to watch. And as a result, we've actually got an R&D program to try to mitigate these issues. Next slide, please. Now, on the transmission side, I just want you to be aware that about half of the cases we get in here right now from FAA involve transmission. Frequently, we get pulled into the transmission process through NEPA because there are a lot of federal lands that have to be crossed, and we're evaluating these projects consistent with how we're evaluating the generation projects as well. And again, we're looking at obstruction issues in EMI. The next slide, please. We'll just show you out west just how many lines right now are proposed. We're working on several of them right now. I think the point to be made here, though, is that, you know, this is really a regional issue, because many of these lines go from, you know, can involve several states, and it would be important to take a, you know, not even just a statewide approach, but a regional approach to a lot of these lines in terms of assisting with their development. And next slide, please, where I'm going to just quickly tell you about our mitigation program. So we're looking at several things right now. We're trying to mitigate the effects of turbines on our long-range radars, which are our surveillance radars. In addition, we're also looking at mitigation for around our terminal radars at the airports. We're looking at what's going on with airborne radar, glare issues, which the FAA is also very interested in, and electromagnetic interference from power lines. I will say, though, that we're actually very hopeful that we're going to be able to do away with a lot of the issues which we currently got with turbines and some other sources, but there is long run going to be an issue with some of our test ranges, which will require pristine environments. And those of you from states or localities where there are test ranges nearby might give more thought to this, because long run mitigation is going to be more difficult in these areas. Next slide, please. And this is going to be my last section, where I'm going to talk briefly about what some other states are working on right now. And next slide, please. And the first one is the California DRECP, which is the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan. Basically, the plan looks at focus areas, and it's basically coming up with a process where it's forward thinking in terms of what areas need to be protected and what areas might be more available to development. And Mr. Imany has actually been very involved with that particular issue. Mike, did you want to say anything about DRECP? Okay, we'll do it at the end. I'm actually going to skip the next two slides so that we don't take too much time and go to the North Carolina legislation one. This is another approach. North Carolina's passed legislation. Basically, it sets up a program where we get informed that a project may be going up. The project is actually very geared towards the local installations, bringing them into it, and the developer has to involved the state of North Carolina early on in the process with a pre-application meeting. So I'll just say within the clearinghouse we have an early notification process outside of the more formal FAA process because we want to talk to people as early as possible. The North Carolina process puts that into statute and it basically forces developers to come in early to let the DoD know of a project. If we could skip the rest of the North Carolina slides and go to slide 25, which is the Virginia Model Ordinance. So I wanted to give two examples of what might go on at the local level. In 2012, the state of Virginia developed a model ordinance for utility-scale wind projects. And what's of note here is that there is a footnote on page 5 providing DoD contacts so that project developers can contact the Defense Department and work with the Defense Department in dealing with their projects. So DoD is not a big part of that, but DoD is certainly mentioned in it, and that's certainly something that could be helpful. Next slide, please. And the next one I wanted to talk to you about is the Kern County Ordinance. Kern County Ordinance has passed Kern County has passed an ordinance which you've got the site on. It deals with the height of structures, and it develops on slide 27, as you will see, next slide, a map. And the map shows red, yellow, and green areas that delineate areas of military concern, with green obviously being a go area, and the dark red being issues which are of areas where we have the largest concern with our installations and ranges out in that area. And so that's just another zoning approach I wanted to point to, and with that I would like to turn this back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. Mike, did you want to add anything to that presentation?
No, I think what we should do is ask Tom Sloan to move forward and bring a perspective from the states, and then open it up for conversations. And depending upon how the conversation goes, I'd love the commitments, but I'd rather get to the conversation phase of the webinar to do that in.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And I will again repeat that if you have any questions, just enter them in the message box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will address those and pose those to our speakers at the after they present, after Representative Sloan finishes his presentation. So on that note, we will introduce our next speaker, Representative Tom Sloan from Kansas. He is serving his 9th term in the Kansas House of Representatives and is the chairman of the Vision 2020 Committee, the legislature's long-range planning committee. He's also a member of the Energy and Utilities Local Government and Agriculture and Natural Resources Budget Committee. He has served as chairman of 2 discussion groups on electric transmission issues at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and is the only state legislative member of the U.S. Department of Energy's 30-member Electricity Advisory Committee. He's also a member of the National Wind Coordinating Collaborative Steering Committee. Representative Sloan also serves on the NCSL Military and Veterans Affairs Task Force and NCSL's Energy Supply Task Force. So let's welcome Representative Sloan.
Thank you, Glenn, and all of the other people on the call. You know, the military bases are economic drivers for local communities and states. We know that. Our bases in Kansas has at least an $8 billion positive impact on our economy. So anything that we can do to support them in our best interests, not just in Kansas, but everywhere. And there will be more base realignment and closures, or BRAC rounds, with or without a congressional directive. Now, the defense budget is being reduced. With the withdrawal of our troops from Southwest Asia, there are going to be a lot fewer people in the armed services, and therefore the needs are going to change. I also noted that the Air Force is talking about the need to change their procurement policies and programs. It takes too long to get these multi-billion-dollar aircraft and such. They need to have a faster process and a leaner, meaner, if you will, service. The others will have to follow suit. It's just an economic thing as well as a personnel matter. So there is no way to BRAC-proof any of our states. But there are things we can do that will improve our ability to support the military and hopefully retain them. Now, first, 2 presidents in Congress have directed the military to reduce energy use, or conserve, and increase energy security and become greener. Assistant Secretary of the Army for Energy, Environment, and Installations has a net zero campaign to reduce energy and water footprints of all Army military bases around the world. Reductions in military purchases of electricity and natural gas will affect rates for civilians as utilities must cover their fixed costs. So as we have a presidential and congressional directive to the military to go greener and to conserve or reduce their total footprint, there are implications for our civilians. Now, in some cases, the military can put renewable generation on their posts. That's some solar in the Southwest and Texas and such. In other areas, they can't, for reasons of aircraft safety, or there is no wind potential at their base, and so they look for areas where they can purchase renewable energy and have it delivered to their post in the most secure manner. Basically trying to minimize the impact that future storms in my area, that'd be tornadoes, and others, it might be hurricanes, would have on the energy supply coming to the base. Now, what can you do as a state legislator, even if you do not have a military base in or near your district? Now, the NCSL Energy Supply Task Force developed a primer, or whatever you want to call a cookbook, in developing a state energy plan. I really encourage you to read it, and as you develop your own, build a section on working with your military. That's the active military, National Guard, the reserves, local recruiting offices, VA hospitals, etc. They all have different needs, but they all are at under requirements to become, as I say, greener and more energy efficient. And talk with your National Guard Adjutant General. What does the Guard need? Now, in Kansas, last November I convened the Electric Rate Making Policy Summit. We had active duty representatives, we had the National Guard, large customers, consumer advocates, regulators, utilities, and such. We talked about how technology is changing the world of energy, that it is technologically and in many ways cost-effective for customers to self-generate, rooftop solar being a good example. Utilities are having to look more and more at managing the impact of these microgrids or micro generators on their system. But what we were talking about in specific terms with the National Guard was that Guard Armory's electric use peaks on the weekend. That's because that's when the troops come in to do their training and such. The utility peak is Monday through Friday in late afternoon, early evening. So the National Guard in Kansas is looking at putting rooftop solar on their armories, allowing the utility to manage it so that the Guard gets lower electric rates. The utility is able to improve the amount of renewable energy it generates. There is increased energy security for the Guard because their electricity will be on site. And the time of day use or the the rate structure would reflect benefits both for the Guard and for the utility. Now, the same thing is possible with the active duty forces. They have large roofs that they can put solar on, or they have the ability to put in energy storage facilities, or even if they've got enough land to put in wind turbines. Essentially, the military does not necessarily want to own the generation, but they want the benefits. So as legislators, one of the things we need to make sure is that we're providing opportunities for our utilities to partner. One of the issues I raised was energy storage. You might want to check and see whether your laws or Public Utility Commission regulations allow utilities to own and operate and recover and earn on storage, batteries or compressed air that's is underground or other types of storage. Back to Kansas for a minute and things that you might consider in your states. There's discussions about an alliance between the National Guard and the big box stores, grocery stores, Walmarts, Dillard's and Dillon's and things of that nature, for rooftop solar that the utility can manage in more locations and in more areas of their system. There is I live in Lawrence, Kansas, has a population of about 90,000 people, not counting the university. There are 7 large grocery stores. Each of them has a lot of roof space that could be used for solar to meet some of their needs, but also to meet utility needs. If you combine that with armories and active duty facilities, you start to get a much bigger rooftop picture and a potentially much better economic and energy reliability security opportunity. Now, the thing that you can do is to bring these parties together and have them start talking about things they maybe haven't thought about. They're also, just for your information, grocery stores have large amounts of backup diesel or gasoline-fired generators. So when the power goes out, they don't lose the cooling in their freezers and such and have all the frozen goods spoil. Again, we're looking at how the utility might be able to call that generation into service to serve neighborhoods if a power line goes down or if a substation has problems. So we're looking at whether or not existing state laws facilitate such innovative partnerships. Now, on a different subject, many states have programs through which state agencies, for example, colleges, can contract with pre-qualified engineering firms to implement energy conservation programs, ESOPs, with energy bill savings paying for the new equipment. The federal government has similar programs. The question I pose to you is there in your state the potential for a state military partnership for larger projects and lower costs to both parties? Again, whether or not you are able to maximize the potential for collaboration. Again, in Kansas, we have a financing agency, the Kansas Financial Development or other, that can lend money for projects and get repaid by the savings on energy. We have made that available to the federal government, to the Department of Defense specifically. Again, Fort Riley, a large military base, is not likely to do it. But we have a Coast Guard pay station in Kansas. Don't ask me why. We're not close to any large bodies of water. But the potential exists for the Coast Guard to partner with us and save themselves some money. Now, encroachment on military bases is something that many of us talk about. And traditionally, we're talking about building retail near a military fence line where you've got lots of parking lot lights, and that impacts negatively the night training capability of soldiers and Marines, or building houses along the aircraft flight path so that they pose a risk if there's an accident of a plane taking off or landing. So we talk about incompatible development there. But I encourage you to think further out, and Bill touched on this in one of his slides where he was talking about Kern County height restrictions. We have a law in Kansas that requires counties many hundreds of miles removed in some cases from military base to clear proposed projects, turbines being a good example, with the Department of Defense because it's in the flight path. Now here we have helicopters more than jet aircraft, although we have some of those too. So the helicopter training, we want to make sure that there aren't going to be transmission lines in their paths or turbines or other solar facilities with the glare, as Bill was mentioning. Again, so we're trying to say encroachment on the military is not just on the fence line, it's further out. And require that counties meet with base commanders quarterly about planned development so that they can get an early start on this. And again, looking at what you can do, you can be the convener to bring your association of counties or your and your military or whomever it is that's appropriate for your states together to start having these discussions. You don't have to have the answers, but you can bring them together and pose the questions. Now, the clearinghouse is vitally important because base commanders tend to change their positions every 2 to 3 years, and their priorities are basically not necessarily coordinating with the civilians around the bases. But you can still good relationships not with the base command staff, but equally, maybe more importantly, with their civilian staff members, their number twos, the permanent people who will be there, their energy manager, their assistant base commander and such. What are their primary energy concerns? Are they reliability, renewable energy, conservation, security, something else? And you have identified what their concern is, then what is it that you can do to try and facilitate that from helping your local utility to meet them? And think creatively. Already talked about storage and as a means of providing energy security for a post, but it also would provide benefits to the utility. Again, it would smooth out energy generation blips because of the intermittency or variability of generation, but it can make sure that your state laws or your regulatory commission rules permit storage to be part of the answer. Now, you also can be more creative. I mean, in Kansas, we explored the possibility with our largest military post of having a regional trash-to-energy operation on their fence line that basically convert the trash to synthetic gas that would be used to generate electricity on post. The trash, the waste, would stay outside the post, generation would be on post, and therefore would provide both security, would help alleviate some regional transportation and disposal problems with the trash from municipalities, but it also would allow the base to use it. Now, this did not move forward in Kansas because our electric rates are low enough that this alternative source was not cost effective. Today, it may be in a couple of years, it may be in your states. And again, that may not be the answer for your people. You can think creatively. Now, in Alaska, Richardson uses landfill gas to generate a third of its electric And that's an example of a base that is actually partnering with the civilians on the outside. You can push that more. And I would encourage you to become involved with both the NCSL Energy Supply Task Force and Veterans Task Force. Remember that VA hospitals are also possible energy partners with your state. And I'm going to close my comments and look forward to your questions with something that is coming out of the Council of State Governments, or CSG. They have developed an interstate high voltage transmission line siting compact. Basically, an effort to simplify the way that high voltage transmission lines that across multiple states boundaries can be sited more expeditiously. The Federal Energy Policy Act of 2005 specifically allows for compacts, specifically identified a compact as a way to avoid any federal backstop siting authority for transmission lines. And I have, following the discussions, the compact has been presented to the clearinghouse staff at the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, Forest Service, Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, as a way to get the federal agencies and states to partner. Now, if you, from the western part of the country, you know that federal government owns or controls up to 80% of some of the western states, Utah and Nevada being good examples. All right, so if transmission lines necessary to serve California are prohibited from crossing federal Department of Defense, Forest Service, etc. lands, then anti-transmission forces become more powerful because you're taking more and more private land, you're getting more and more congestion in public corridors. So what the CSG siting compact is an effort to do is to say, all right, how do we accommodate federal agency needs, state needs, tribal needs? And the Department of Energy directive is the lead agency in bringing the energy policy of all the federal agencies together, and they are having what are called QER sessions, Quadrennial Energy Review. So we're trying to get the Department of Energy, on behalf of all federal agencies, including the defense, to look at how do we jointly plan for electric transmission, natural gas pipelines, energy corridors, most cost effectively and responsibly serve the energy needs of our country, and can accommodate both public and private lands issues. With that, I will stop and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Representative Sloan. That was an excellent introduction and overview of what role state policymakers can play in really addressing these issues. And we do have a number of questions for our presenters today. So I'll start off with a question for Bill. Can you talk more about the law in North Carolina and what some of the benefits of this policy are from DOD's perspective?
Okay, the law in North Carolina basically sets up an early notification process, and there are two prongs to that. The law, first of all, requires that DENR, which is the North Carolina, I think it's the North Carolina, basically the North Carolina Environmental Office, be informed of the project, and it also notifies the base commanders in the state of a project. And what it does is it then sets up a dialogue, so that if, and North Carolina has some very large installations in it, so it sets up the ability to have a dialogue early in a process so that you can conceivably work on this, let's say, the siting plan for wind turbines within a wind turbine farm. And the reason this is important is that there are farms that we'll look at where the vast majority of the farm is actually acceptable, and then you've got a couple turbines that are not. And so with early consultation, you might be able to avoid those few that are a problem.
Thank you. And this one, I guess, is really targeted towards Representative Sloan and potentially Bill as well. You highlighted a lot of work that's being done in Kansas and how you've initiated a lot of collaboration and coordination with DOD lands. And I guess the question is how that was initiated, whether it was more of a policymaker as leader in initiating and as a community or state leader, or whether there's also, to what degree, there's also some sort of legislative initiative to enable that coordination to take place.
It's a good question. The many base commanders believe they are not supposed to lobby state government. So, when you ask them what they need, some commanders won't tell you. Others understand that they can respond to questions, and they're anxious to sort of protect their long-term interests by having the state aware of what's needed. So, the short answer is many of the issues that I've addressed in Kansas and which we talked about a few minutes ago come from two sources. My work with the NCSL task forces, the Energy Supply and the Military and the Veterans Affairs task forces. Part of them come from going to our regional Department of Defense representatives. Each region has an office with environmental experts and such. And then the third is that I have actually sat down with the base commanders and civilian staff of our major installations in Kansas. And usually I've sat down not just with myself personally, but I'll bring some folks from our state environmental agency, or I'll bring some folks from our Public Utility Commission, so that we can talk about where existing state laws and procedures and such might be an impediment to partnerships, or might be able to stimulate them. Some of those have required action, and so we've been able to do that. But I'll give you just one. I had Air Force Base employee who happened to be a neighbor tell me that the state was measuring their cleaning solvent by the number of gallons used, regardless of whether the solvent was being reused. So they were doing is they take a 5 gallons of solvent, use it to clean aircraft parts, the grease, and then they would clean the solvent and reuse the 5 gallons again. Well, our state environmental agency was saying, no, that's not the same 5 gallons, it's a new 5 gallons. Well, that was absurd because it made a difference to the environmental hazards or whatever that were on post. I talked to the secretary of our environmental agency, and our policy changed. I mean, again, it's just that was a fortuitous conversation I had, but a legislator can, by stimulating discussion, solve a lot of problems.
Hey, Glenn, this is Mike Imany. Could I chime in on that?
Absolutely.
Thanks, Glenn. This is Mike Imany. I'm the Executive Director for the DoD Siting Clearinghouse. Many states have something called a Commander's Council, and that Commander's Council meets, well, maybe semi-annually with all the commanders of the military installations. It isn't inappropriate for the Commanders Conference to reach out, council to reach out to state legislators and ask them to speak at their council. So, weaseling your way into that is a way going. Now, if you don't know if you have one, generally speaking, every military base has an active, what's called commander's shadowing program. So when I was commander at Maelstrom, one of the squadrons at Maelstrom Air Force Base, I had a civilian commander, honorary commander to my squadron, and that individual happened to be a county commissioner. And so there is ways of getting to an understanding. Ultimately, if you don't know if you have a commander's council in your state, or if it's not active, your adjutant general within the state, which you probably have connectivity to, on, of course, the executive branch of the state government, but still, the adjutant general usually has a pretty good understanding of who are the commanders and if there's an active commander's council. So plug into the commander's council if it exists in your state. Not all states have them. It is really dependent upon the states and how active those commanders are of wanting to talk to one another about issues within the state and in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And that might be something, if we do have that information on the states that have those, we could post or inform our participants out so that they do know who they would actually contact there, and that might make it a little easier and promote that action. And we did have another question here regarding there's federal rulemaking underway that addresses some of these encroachment issues. What does that rulemaking focus on, and what will it actually accomplish?
Okay, so this is Bill, and I did very briefly mention the federal rule in my presentation. So we have the statute. The rule is located at 32 CFR Part 211. So it's in the Code of Federal Regulations. It's entitled Mission Compatibility Evaluation Process. It sets up two processes. So there's an informal review process whereby developers can come to the clearinghouse and, in essence, get an advisory opinion as to whether a project is going to be of concern to us as they move to the more formal process. The more formal process is the process under the FAA's obstruction evaluation process, and what it does for us under both of them, the rule sets up timelines under which we need to respond to an application. So, for instance, under the FAA process, we have 30 days to get back initially, and then if we choose, if there's an issue and we need to do some kind of mitigation response team in order to try to find a way to mitigate, then we get an additional 90 days to respond, and then that can be extended further with the mutual consent of the Defense Department and the developer. And frankly, they do go beyond 90 days because it's a fairly complex process, which is, again, why we encourage people to come in through the informal process, because the FAA statute actually requires people to go in 45 days before they're going to start a project, and 45 days is completely insufficient to really come up with a mitigation response. I think, Mike, did you want to say something about state involvement with this?
Yeah, I'll pick on here, and if it generates a chat in the chat room, I would love to take the few minutes that are left in the conversation and steer it towards. So you've heard that we have this federal rulemaking process, and we use the Federal Aviation Administration's obstruction evaluation process, which leads to determinations of hazard or determinations of no hazards with regards to obstructions as they might impact safe navigation. Yet it's my opinion that, and clearly I come out of a state's view, it's clearly my view that the land in the states are the states, and the states have the rights, and what we feds need to do is try to find ways to work within the individual states to respect their states' primacy on land use, and balancing, as Representative Sloan said, balancing the need of clean energy and potential military capability is something we're extremely interested in. And we do believe here in Washington that this is a state-by-state discussion. And some states have already, as Bill has briefed, some states have adopted this at the county level, Kern County, Cascade County, Montana. I can name a number of counties that have implemented rulemaking or ordinances or siting approaches. Some states have done it at the state level, say, for example, the North Carolina that Bill mentioned, or Oregon, which has a fairly formal energy facility siting council that has the authority to provide site certificates. Is there a role in how might the federal government collaborate with the many states on bringing the right kind of legislative remedy, if you will, that would allow for compatible energy and military use in each of the states? And this is obviously a state-by-state discussion, but that's what I'd like to turn the last 5 minutes to, Glenn, if you don't mind.
Well, this is Tom Sloan, and I want to interject because Kansas is one of those states that does not have either statewide zoning, or many counties don't have zoning. So that's where the legislature becomes involved, as I say, in passing legislation that requires local county officials to meet with base commanders quarterly on proposed developments, because otherwise there is nothing that's going to force local folks to play nice, if you will.
Yeah, and this is Glenn. I would add that, that's true in many states. There are some states that do have some sort of statewide siting guidelines, for instance, when it comes to siting wind. But most states do not. It is really a local, comes down to a lot of times to local jurisdiction. So that's definitely another area where policymakers can I guess investigate when it comes to ensuring that statewide there is some sort of coherent guidelines when it comes to siting.
We generate any chats in the chat room, Glenn?
Yeah, I mean, we had another question here related to base realignment and closure. In past rounds or future rounds of discussions on base realignment and closure, where encroachment-related energy issues are being considered related to the base's closure, do you see this being a factor going forwards?
The policy of the department is to state that we have requested a round or multiple rounds of base closure in the future, and until we do so, these kinds of questions or answers to these types of questions are to be held in abeyance. So we don't know, and nor honestly can I say that there is not any work going on that would lead to the answer to that type of question. We've been asked to...
I'm sorry, go ahead, Mike.
We've been asked to essentially request the round and wait for the federal legislative branch to respond, and then those kinds of questions and answers will be dealt with. Thank you.
And this is Tom. And as I say, with the withdrawal of the troops from Southwest Asia theaters, and a lot of those forces are going to be returning to civilian life, the missions are changing for our military. I view thinking about DRECP as being an insurance plan. What do you need to do to help your base survive? And one of them is in energy security, renewable energy, reliability, and all that, the things we've been talking about. Protecting the bases. So if you wait for Congress to act, then it's a bit like Mike and Bill were talking about was they want to know early what wind projects are on the horizon so they can work out whether there'll be a conflict with the Department of Defense functions. I'm suggesting that as legislators, you start looking at where you can help your base become more secure, whether that's in terms of preventing encroachment or helping them to partner with your local utility to get better rates, helping them to partner with the National Guard to get better rates collectively, or something else. You start to think proactively and long-term.
Thank you, Representative Sloan. And in conclusion, Bill and Representative Sloan, do you have any, I guess, summary commentary you'd like to offer with regards to how you think policymakers should be thinking about this issue and what some of their best steps would be if they want to pursue and address issues of encroachment and ensure that that is that their state does take this issue into consideration as they work with local developers and siting.
This is Bill, so I can start. I'd like to say a big thank you to everybody who participated in this. I think rather than give you words of wisdom as to how I'd have you participate, what I'd really rather do is start a dialogue and say that Mike and I are both very open to discussing how we can work issues with state and local governments. And I don't believe actually on my slide deck I put my email address, but I will add it on the final copy so that everyone has it. I'll say it's actually pretty easy. It's william.j.vanhouten.civ for civilian at mail.mil. But I will. I'll send that out. You can also use the mailbox on the Clearinghouse website, which is in the packet.
Yeah, and we'll make sure that those the links to the Clearinghouse and contact information is posted for attendees. And Representative Sloan?
Well, I also appreciate everyone who's been on the call and hope that you found some of our comments useful to you. But I have also worked and met with Bill and Mike over the last few years, and they are very sincere when they say they want to work with us. Beyond that, I would encourage you again to look at the work products from the NCSL Energy Supply Task Force, particularly the State Energy Planning document. And as I said, look at having a specific section that you partner with your DoD facilities.
Thanks, Representative Sloan. Well, I want to give a big thanks to all of our speakers, Representative Tom Sloan and Bill Van Houten, and also Mike Imany for contributing to this webinar. And as a reminder, we will be posting the recording of the webinar as well as the PDFs of the PowerPoints at our website, and we'll send that link out shortly so you have access to these resources. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll also be having a publication exploring this topic that will be released in September. So thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you on our next webinar.